Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Hopefully you guys are doing good. We're going to be taking another look at a device today, and I've dropped a ton of these videos today, mostly because I'm away from my regular studio, so I have to drop these still worth it videos that I was going to drop anyway, so I might as well drop them now. And so far, I've actually talked about a ton of iPads this year. I've talked about really all the main first iPads, the iPad 1, iPad 2, iPad 3. Now we're talking about the iPad 4. I think I've already reviewed all the iPad minis this year too. What's left now is a couple more iPad Pros and that's it. But we're going to be looking at the iPad 4 and seeing how it holds up in 2020. Now this device specifically came out in 2012, which technically was the same year as the iPhone 5. And it's hard to believe that phone came out in 2012 because the design is still pretty current. I pick up my iPhone SE all the time and I'm like, wow, this phone still kind of holds up, and the iPhone 5 is more or less the same in terms of the body. But with the iPad 4, with it being released in 2012, it'll actually be turning 8 years old this year, which is pretty insane. I mean, this thing in terms of the design is pretty aged for sure. I mean, it has a lot of bezel around the display, but it doesn't look that bad, and the display itself is actually pretty decent. And even starting off with the front, I mean, this thing has a 9.7-inch IPS panel on it, and it's not a bad design at all. I mean, it's a pretty, popular one. I think a lot of people already know what it looks like. You have that front camera at the top. You have quite a bit of bezel all around the, body of this thing, which isn't that bad. A lot of people are already kind of used to it, to be honest, and with it being just a single front-facing camera with that much bezel, it's pretty surprising considering we've cut that space down quite a bit for all of those. On the bottom, you can see we have a home button, and that's actually really cool. A lot of people like that new gesture-based design. I like it too. I like that one a lot more than this one, but having that physical home button isn't really the end-all be-all. I think the overall bezel along this device is definitely one thing that a lot of people don't like, including me. And if this thing just got one more version of iOS, if it got iOS 11, this thing would have had a whole different experience, especially considering the fact that it probably would have been more buggy. But the gestures that came with iOS 11 was really, really nice, and I really do like those gestures that iOS 11 brought. But with iOS 10.3, which this one ended off, it didn't do a bad job at all, in my opinion. Now, looking on the bottom, this was actually one of the first iPads to actually bring the Lightning port. Before we had that 30-pin connector, which was on those super old iPhones, including the iPhone 4 and 3G and even the first one. With this one, it actually didn't bring that. It brought the Lightning port, which came with the iPhone 5, and that was one of the smartest things Apple ever did. And as you guys know, with the newest iPads and newest iPhones, all those have Lightning ports, and that's definitely a super smart choice that Apple did. And with the capability that this one has with that Lightning port, it's really, really cool. It doesn't have the craziest capability with it. iOS 11 brought a lot of cool things, so did iOS 12. But this thing still has a lot of capability with that Lightning port, which is really cool. We also have a headphone jack on this thing as well, which if you're going to use it, that's awesome. If you're not, it really doesn't matter. You have that capability on this device, which is really, really nice. On the back, you can see a regular design. I mean, everyone's seen this iPad 4 before, but you have that single camera on this thing too. And like I usually say, I mean, nobody's really going to be using these cameras anymore on these things. It's more or less just to have it on these if you're going to FaceTime somebody, if you're going to do something like that. At the end of the day, you have that capability on these devices where you might not necessarily have them on another tablet at that time back in 2012. Some Android tablets, I'm sure, didn't even have any cameras on them. I know the original Nexus 7 maybe had the front camera, but it didn't have a back one, and the Nexus 7, the one after that, brought it, but it's still an interesting thing that you kind of have to remember at the end of the day. So in terms of the overall body, it still feels like a very premium device. It doesn't feel like the best device though anymore, considering also the fact that it has all that bezel on the front. But for the most part, it's still pretty capable in terms of the way it looks for sure. So in terms of the design, I think I'll give it a thumbs up. It's definitely not a thumbs down, but it's definitely not wowing anybody, I don't think, anymore. Now moving on to the software, this thing came out in 2012. Like I said, it started off with iOS 6, which was pretty much the most up-to-date version of software at that time, and then iOS 7 came out the year after, which was one of the biggest updates ever, and we are able to get iOS 10.3 on it, which if you consider it now, I mean, that's a super outdated version of software right now, especially, considering the fact that we're on iOS 13 right now and we have tons of cool features with that. iOS 14 is around the corner, but still, iOS 10 is pretty capable for the most part, even on an iPad. The main thing that dates it is just the UI, the way it looks, but other than that, it kind of still looks the same. I mean, even if you look at my thing on the video, it looks pretty good if you ask me. It doesn't seem super outdated, it doesn't seem super buggy. The thing with iOS 10 was that it came out right after iOS 9, and iOS 9 was pretty good. iOS 7 was super buggy, and it seems like every version of software after that was pretty much trying to play catch up and fix a lot of issues that the previous version of software brought. And I think iOS 10, considering it was right before iOS 11, and which is usually considered one of the more buggier softwares ever released by Apple, iOS 10 was a pretty good staple in terms of the overall longevity of devices, and phones like the iPhone 5, the iPad 4 for example, these devices have somehow held up pretty well over time. And even with my iPhone 5, every time I pick it up to go make a video about or just use as a filler device in the meantime of a video or whatever, it still picks up for the most part, and it still handles everything I throw at it just fine, which is very, very impressive, you know what I mean? So it's really cool to have specific devices like that. If you're going to have a device that, as a beater device or just a device in the, side, it's really cool to have something that's stable. And obviously it's, pretty unsecure in terms of software. It's not getting any extra versions of software on top of it. But where it ended off, it really wasn't a bad point. But obviously you were a couple years behind in the software, so it's not getting any more software updates now. But I definitely do appreciate the fact that it had ended on iOS 10 than maybe getting iOS 11, even though those features would have been cool. So in terms of the software, that pretty much covers it. Now hitting on the performance, this thing has the Apple A6X chip, a dual-core CPU, and there were a couple different models of this thing, 4 different models, a 16, 32, 64, and 128 gig model, and all those models had 1 gigabyte of RAM. What I can tell you about the performance of this iPad is the fact that it stopped at iOS 10, it was kind of like a sweet spot of this device, because the performance and, the background processes, which iOS doesn't really need a lot of, but the demand of the apps and everything at that time, it really didn't require those many, performance heavy specs. You didn't need like 15 gigabytes of RAM or crazy Apple A10 chipset or anything like that at the time, which is probably more or less a better thing than a non-better thing. So for the most part, this iPad was able to do mostly everything you needed to do with it. It was faster than I thought, which was pretty surprising. It was kind of smooth, but once you start loading apps, once you start doing anything with it, that's when you start to notice this thing kind of, being bogged down and being much slower. It's definitely not the fastest thing in the world. And even at that time when it stopped on iOS 10, it wasn't even one of the fastest iPads. We had a ton of different iPads at the time. We had some of the iPad Pros were at the time too. And this iPad 4 was more or less just kind of a filler device at the time. And I think for the performance that it brought, I think it was definitely cool and everything, but in terms of the performance, I think it's definitely one of the more lackluster things about it. If you're going to use it as like a student and you're going to go and just fill in Word documents and this and that, I think it'll be able to handle it okay, but even then I have a hard time suggesting it, mostly because if you're taking notes, if you're writing papers or whatever, you're going to constantly be going from one app to the other, to the other, to the other, and because of that, this phone doesn't have those many specs like I stated, and it doesn't have like a crazy amount of power or anything, so because of that, you might run into an issue where apps are closing out in the background, and you definitely don't want to be in a position like that. So if you're a student, I wouldn't really look at this thing as a big performing device. If you need something for the time being, then I guess it's okay, but as a main device, I highly would not recommend it. Even if you want something as like a side iPad, I mean, you can do much better for, around the same price. So in terms of performance, I give it like a okay score. I don't give it like anything above average, in my opinion. So that pretty much covers it up there. Now hitting on the camera, like I said, this thing has a front camera and a back camera, a 5 megapixel back facing camera and a 1.2 megapixel front facing camera. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, I guess it gets the job done at the end of the day. You can shoot 1080p videos on that back camera, but other than that, you don't really have that much capability for anything else. On that front camera, like I said, 1.2 megapixels, it can shoot HD video. Most people are at the end of the day are going to use it for FaceTime calls and things like that. I'm sure they're not going to use it for anything else. They're not filming videos on it. They're not doing anything crazy. You do have some capability at the end of the day, taking photos and videos, but I highly would not recommend it. So that really pretty much covers it up in the camera. I'm going to end off with the battery life, which is probably one of the better aspects of this device for sure. This thing has a 11,560 milliamp hour battery, which for sure is the highlight of this iPad. This thing will be able to last you for many, many days. You can use it one day, come back the next day, use it again, and it probably won't die even a week into using it. Now, keep this in mind, even if this battery has degraded a couple thousand% or a couple thousand milliamp hours, which it probably has, this thing, is pretty old, this thing will still be having probably an 8 or 9,000 milliamp hour battery inside of it, which is insane. But this battery has so much power into it. And the fact of the matter is that the screen, even though it's a little high resolution, it's not crazy. It's not like a 4K screen, it's like a little bit above Quad HD for sure, but it's not that powerful of a device. It doesn't really require that much power, but you have a humongous size battery in it, which adds so much to the overall value. And even though, to kind of sum up the video, I really wouldn't recommend people to buy it, the battery is still really, really good and I can't knock it there. So to kind of sum up the video and to answer the question, is the iPad 4 still worth it in 2020? I would say probably not. I still think, it has a little bit of value, but the fact that it's, a couple years outdated in terms of software and, it's not really that powerful, I really wouldn't recommend the average person getting it. You can easily get like an iPad Pro 10.5 inch for like 300, 400, and that would do you much, much better in the long run. Even iPads like the iPad Mini 4 will do you much better too. And something like this, I really wouldn't recommend it for the price and, performance that you're getting. I really would not recommend people buying this, to be honest. So that really pretty much covers it up there. I will go ahead and find links to the cheapest iPad Pro 10.5 inches and iPad Mini 4s that I find on Amazon. I'll link them down in the description below so you guys can get it from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that is pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.